Embossing folders have become popular again, and today I'm showing you how to use two 3D embossing folders to create some beautiful backgrounds for your cards with just a couple of simple techniques. Hey, it's Verity here and welcome to my YouTube channel and blog Pretty Little Button, where I make paper crafting tutorials for the everyday crafter. This video and blog post is part of a blog hop with Altenew. It's part of their Wondrous World Dies Stencil Embossing Folders collection release and blog hop, so I will give some more information about this later on in the video with some details about the giveaway and how you can enter. For today's cards, I'm using two new folders from Altenew. The first one here is Diamond Stars. I've just embossed it in some white cardstock just as is, and it's got this beautiful sort of star pattern. Now you can use either side. And with 3D embossing folders, they have more of a varying level of debossing and embossing. So it's not going to be just one flat raise layer and one flat deboss layer. The second embossing folder I'm using is the Altenew Mod Squares. I really love this pattern. It's a beautiful pattern and they do have this also as a background stamp. But I love this for the texture it gives on a background. So I'm going to show you two techniques to use these to step up your embossing folder techniques. And not just use them just as is. So I've got the Diamond Stars embossing folder and I've just opened it up. Now I am first of all going to add some ink to this embossing folder. So the ink I'm using here is the Lavender Fields ink, a lovely soft lilac. And I'm just rubbing this ink over one side of the embossing folder. So for this side, I am rubbing this over the ink where I have a lot of thin lines raised over it. So when I then run it through my die cutting machine, ink is going to transfer where I have placed it on the embossing folder. So here, it's very, very subtle because I use a very soft colour, but it has gone in all the thin lines that outline that star pattern. Now you can also do it on the opposite side. When I'm doing this on the opposite side, there's not as many sort of flat areas. You've got varying different levels of embossing. So when I add the ink, it's going to not have a very necessarily a uniform pattern, which I don't mind. But when I run this through the die cutting machine, all the ink transfers into the nooks and crevices of the embossing. And it really brings out that kind of diamond pattern. And I really, really loved how this turned out. However, as I said, because these are 3D embossing folders, they have varying levels of embossing and debossing. Ink, when you apply it that way, doesn't always transfer evenly if you're looking for a nice, perfect looking transfer. So for the second technique, I'm just going to show you using the Mod Squares embossing folder. And this time, instead of using coloured ink, I am using embossing ink. So I've applied this to one side of the embossing folder. I have then run that through my die cutting machine. And then I'm covering it with some embossing powder. As you can see, when I first did it, I couldn't remember which side I put my ink on. So obviously the embossing powder didn't stick on the first side. But then when you add your embossing powder on, it sticks to where you have placed all that embossing ink that's transferred from the folder to your cardstock. So it has gone into the real nooks and crevices of this Mod Squares pattern, so into those main squares. Again, you're not always going to get the most perfect transfer of ink, depending on how much you smoosh your pad down and how much you lightly cover it. But this really brings out that square pattern in this design. So I really loved how it turned out and I just used my heat gun to heat set that. So I also did this exact same method. I just applied the ink to the other side of the embossing folder and then covered this. So this goes down into sort of the nooks and crannies and more of the lines, leaving the squares negative from embossing powder. And this brings out that beautiful, intricate pattern. And I really loved how this turned out. Again, depending on how much you smoosh your ink pad down onto the folder, how sort of firm you are with that depends on how much ink transfers and how much of your embossing sticks all over it. But when you heat set it, you get a beautiful, beautiful pattern. And I love how it turns out with this white and gold look to it. Now to turn these into some cards, I have used all the background panels. For the double embossed background panels, I used one of the panels just as is on a card base and then added a white nesting labels die cut. And on this, I've added some of the new Branches and Berries die cuts. And I just added some soft grey to it using the Morning Frost ink with a blending tool just to highlight those from the back of the nesting labels die. And then I finished it off with a sentiment using the Altenew Sentiment Strips stamp set. For the other background, I wanted to create a bit of a sort of focal window frame around that background, and I used the nesting labels die, a large one of these dies, out of some white cardstock. Once I'd done that, I then used the embossing folder, same embossing folder, the Mod Squares embossing folder, to run that through my die cutting machine to emboss the pattern. Now I tried my best when I was putting it into the embossing folder to try and line the pattern up with the same pattern that I'd used, positioning that I'd used on the first embossing panel. So that when I added it to a card base, I foam mounted it to give a bit of depth. But the pattern continued from the non-double embossed frame through to the double embossed background. And it just is a bit more seamless in appearance. To finish that card off, I used the new Fancy Celebrate die, and I die cut this 3 times out of some grey cardstock and just layered them up for a bit more dimension, and added another sentiment strip from the Altenew Sentiment Strip stamp set, heat embossing this in white onto some black cardstock. And then to finish these 2 cards off, I just wanted to tie in some of that gold a little bit more, and I added some gold matte sequins in various sizes, just scattering them around the card. For the inked embossed backgrounds, I'm adding some die cuts to this, and I'm using the new Floral Lace die, which is a beautiful big die. So if you love to do some really big card designs that are bigger than A2, then this is a great die to have because it will fill your card quite easily. It's also great if you love to do scrapbook layouts, mixed media, journals, those kind of things, because this is a really good big size die. It's a lovely intricate die as well. I'm just using my Altenew stamping mat, and because this is silicone, it holds the die cut quite well and quite steady as I ink blend. And I'm using my lavender fields again with an Altenew ink blending tool, just to add a soft lavender blend over the top of this, just to tie in with the ink that I used on the embossed background and to allow it to stand out from that background. Now you could use any die cuts on these embossed backgrounds, and you could use any embossing folders you have for all of these techniques. So just have a look what you have in your stash. So as you can see, as I place it over the top, it just pops off that white background. I finished this card off with a few sentiments again from the Altenew Sentiments Strips stamp set, and a few sequins as well. For the last background, I wanted to add some florals to it, but because I'd used purple, I knew that yellow is a complementary colour of purple, so I thought I would create a yellow flower to complement that, as well as a purple flower. So for this card, I'm using the new Climber Flowers die set. This allows you to produce 2 different flowers and 2 different sets of leaves. And as I said, I was going to use a yellow sort of colour scheme for one of the flowers and a purple colour scheme for another. Because I haven't got many different colours of yellow cardstock, what I'm going to do, because this is a layering die, you want different colours for each of your layers, all I'm doing is I'm ink blending each layer. So I'm using my Altenew small ink blending tool and then a selection of yellows. For the first layer, I use Citrus Burst, which is the lightest layer. I then went in with Fresh Lemon for the second layer, so you want this a little bit darker. And for the last third layer of this floral, I used Maple Yellow. So when these layer up, they have a bit of variation, but they're all yellow. And I didn't have to get different colours of yellow cardstock because you don't often have that many different shades of yellow cardstock. This is a great way of creating different colours for a small die cut like this. And then for the purple, I used Soft Lilac, Lavender Fields, and Deep Iris. For the greens, I used a selection of Lime and Limeade inks to ink blend. And once these were all assembled, I just used a bit of liquid adhesive to adhere the layers together. I then added it to the front of the embossed panel with the ink more in the recess of the embossing folder. And I added this to the front of a card panel and added a sentiment strip just to finish it off. Now, I did mention this as part of a blog hop and giveaway with Altenew. Make sure you head over to my blog if you're watching this on my YouTube channel. You can comment over there and hop along. And the more you comment and the more you hop along, the more chance you have of winning as part of the giveaway. Altenew have $300 in total in prizes to give away. This is to celebrate this release. They're giving 2 $50 gift cards as well as 10 $20 gift cards as well. You need to make sure you hop along, leave a comment on the Altenew blog, as well as a variety of different designers by the 22nd of February. They will announce the winner over on their Altenew winner page. So I hope this has shown you a couple of different ways to step up your embossing folders when you use them on your cardstock By all means, use them as is. It's a great technique of adding some texture, and I do love to use them with just white card for tone on tone look, to add a bit of interest to your background but without distracting or detracting from your focal image. But this is a great way just to add a little bit of variation and get more from your embossing folders. If you're new to my channel, why not think about subscribing and hitting that bell icon so you'll be notified when my next video is up. There are links to products in the description box below. And until next time, happy crafting!